The gunshot that killed Jonathan Miller echoed through Julia Miller's life long after the sound itself had faded, transforming her from a blissful newlywed into a grief-stricken widow in the dusty town of Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878. It was a bank robbery gone wrong. Julia had been told a stray bullet, an innocent bystander. Just 18 months into their marriage, she was left alone with their 3-month-old son, Samuel. For years had passed since that day, and life in Copper Creek hadn't gotten any easier for a woman raising a child on her own. Julia wiped the sweat from her brow as she arranged fabric bolts in the front display of Thornton's Mercantile. The summer heat was oppressive, even in the early morning hours, but she was grateful for the job. Mr. Thornton was one of the few shop owners in town willing to employ a woman with a young child, allowing little Samuel to sit quietly in the corner of the store while she worked. "Mama, look what I drew." Samuel held up a crude sketch of what appeared to be a horse, his small face beaming with pride. "That's wonderful, darling," Julia said, smiling despite her exhaustion. She adjusted her plain cotton dress and pushed a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. At 24, she still possessed the beauty that had once made her the most sought-after young woman in Copper Creek, though worry lines had begun to form around her blue eyes. The bell above the door jingled, and Mrs. Whitaker entered with her son Thomas, who was about Samuel's age. Julia forced a pleasant expression. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker. Can I help you find something today?" Mrs. Whitaker barely acknowledged Julia, turning instead to examine a display of lace. Thomas, however, strutted directly toward Samuel. "Whatcha drawing, bastard boy?" Thomas sneered, using a word he'd clearly heard from adults but didn't fully understand. Samuel's face fell, his small shoulders hunching forward. "Thomas," Julia gasped. "That's not a nice word." Mrs. Whitaker glanced over lazily. "Well, it's what they call children without fathers, isn't it? The boy should get used to it." Her voice carried just enough for the other customers to hear. Julia felt heat rise to her cheeks. This wasn't the first time Samuel had been taunted for being fatherless. In a town where respectability was everything, being a widow with a young child meant living on the fringes of society. "My husband died honorably," Julia said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Samuel has nothing to be ashamed of." Mrs. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "Of course, dear, though some do wonder why a proper young widow hasn't remarried. It's not natural. A boy growing up without a man's influence." Before Julia could respond, the door opened again, and a tall figure blocked the sunlight streaming in. The store fell silent as Ryker Irwin stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Dust from the trail covered his denim pants and cotton shirt, and a leather vest hugged his broad shoulders. Ryker had arrived in Copper Creek just 2 weeks ago, taking a job at the Mason Ranch outside town. He was already developing a reputation as a skilled horseman and a man who kept to himself. "Morning, ladies," he said, nodding politely as he approached the counter. His voice was deep but gentle, with a slight southern drawl. "Mr. Thornton around?" "I've got an order from Mr. Mason. He's in the back," Julia replied, grateful for the interruption. "I'll fetch him for you." As she turned to go, Thomas gave Samuel a rough shove, sending the smaller boy tumbling to the floor. "Bastard can't even sit right," he laughed. Samuel's eyes welled with tears as he scrambled to gather his scattered drawings. "Hey now," Ryker said, crossing the store in 3 long strides. He knelt beside Samuel, helping him collect his papers. "These are mighty fine drawings, partner. You've got talent." Samuel looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Thomas snickered. "He ain't got no pa to teach him nothing." Something flashed in Ryker's eyes, a momentary hardness that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He stood and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, then looked directly at Thomas and Mrs. Whitaker. "Where I come from, a man shows respect to a woman raising her son alone, and a boy with a father should have been taught better manners." His tone was conversational, but there was steel beneath the words. Mrs. Whitaker's face flushed. "I don't believe that's any of your concern, Mr. Irwin. Ryker Irwin." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And madam, when a child is being unkind to another under my watch, I make it my concern." He knelt back down beside Samuel, who was still fighting tears. With a gentle hand, Ryker put his arm around the boy's shoulders. Then, to Julia's surprise, he extended his other arm, inviting her into the circle. Hesitantly, she stepped forward, and Ryker's arm encircled her waist. The three of them stood together, a united front against the whispering town. "No more," Ryker said quietly, but firmly enough for everyone in the store to hear. "This boy has a mother who loves him, and that's worth more than most kids get in this world." The store had gone completely silent. Even Mrs. Whitaker seemed at a loss for words. Julia felt something shift inside her chest, a feeling she'd thought long buried with her husband. Gratitude, yes, but something more too. Something that both frightened and exhilarated her. Ryker squeezed Samuel's shoulder once more before releasing them both. "Now, those drawings," he said to Samuel as if nothing unusual had happened. "Is that a Mustang you've drawn there?" Samuel nodded shyly. "Well, I work with horses over at Mason Ranch. Maybe sometime your ma would let me show you some real ones. If that's all right with her, of course." He glanced at Julia, his hazel eyes asking permission. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Irwin," Julia managed, still flustered by his unexpected defense. "Samuel would like that." Mrs. Whitaker huffed and grabbed Thomas's hand. "We'll return another time," she said stiffly, pulling her son toward the door. As they left, Mr. Thornton emerged from the back room. "Mr. Irwin, got that order ready for Mason. Just need to check a few items with you." Ryker nodded, then turned back to Julia. "Sunday after church, if it suits you. I could bring a gentle mare for the boy to meet." "Yes," Julia heard herself say. "Thank you." After Ryker left with the Mason Ranch supplies, Mr. Thornton approached Julia. His normally stern face had softened. "That was quite a scene, Mrs. Miller." Julia busied herself with straightening merchandise. "I apologize if it disrupted business." "No apology needed. Been wanting to say something to Whitaker and those other gossips myself." He paused. "You're a good worker, Julia, and Samuel's a fine boy. Don't let anyone tell you different." Julia blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton." The rest of the day passed in a blur. When her shift ended, Julia took Samuel's hand and headed toward their small rented cabin on the edge of town. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but Julia barely noticed the heat. Her mind kept returning to the moment when Ryker had put his arm around them both, creating a circle of protection that had felt strangely like family. "Mama, will we really see the horses on Sunday?" Samuel asked, skipping beside her. "Yes, if you'd like to." "I would, and I like Mr. Irwin. He's nice." Julia smiled. "Yes, he was very nice today." That night, after tucking Samuel into bed, Julia sat on their small porch, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about the future as something more than just surviving day to day. Sunday arrived clear and bright. Julia dressed Samuel in his best clothes and put on her only good dress, a simple blue cotton that Jonathan had always said matched her eyes. They walked to the small wooden church at the center of town, where Julia sat in their usual spot near the back. She couldn't help noticing the whispers and glances from the other churchgoers. News of what had happened at the mercantile had clearly spread through town. Some looks seemed sympathetic, others curious, and a few like Mrs. Whitaker's remained coldly disapproving. Halfway through the sermon, Julia felt rather than saw someone enter the church. A few heads turned, and she glanced back to see Ryker sliding into the last pew. He caught her eye and nodded slightly. Julia quickly faced forward again, her heart beating inexplicably faster. After the service, as people gathered outside to socialize, Julia stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd with Samuel. She was used to being politely ignored at these gatherings, and today seemed no different. "Mrs. Miller." Ryker's voice came from behind her. "Samuel." She turned to find him looking remarkably different from the dusty cowboy who had entered the mercantile. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean white shirt with a string tie. He still had the same kind eyes, though, and the same gentle smile. "Mr. Irwin," she replied. "I didn't know you attended services here. First time, actually. Thought it might be good to meet some folks in town." He knelt down to Samuel's level. "Still want to see those horses, young man?" Samuel nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sir." "Good. Because there's a pretty Palomino mare who's been waiting to meet you." Julia noticed several people watching their interaction with undisguised interest. She recognized Sheriff Parker among them. His eyes narrowed as he studied Ryker. "Perhaps we should go," she suggested quietly. "People are starting to stare." Ryker straightened and offered his arm. "Let them stare. You've got nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Miller." The walk to Mason Ranch took nearly an hour. Under different circumstances, Julia might have been concerned about being seen walking with a man she barely knew, but Ryker's respectful manner put her at ease. He kept a proper distance as they walked, and directed most of his conversation towards Samuel, asking about his drawings and telling stories about different horses he'd known. By the time they reached the ranch, Samuel was chattering away as if he'd known Ryker his whole life. Julia watched them together, noticing how naturally Ryker responded to her son's questions, never talking down to him or dismissing his childish enthusiasm. "Here we are," Ryker said as they approached a corral near the main barn. Inside was a beautiful golden-colored horse with a cream-colored mane and tail. "This is Daisy. She's the gentlest horse on the ranch." Samuel's eyes widened. "She's so big. But she's kind," Ryker assured him. "Want to feed her an apple?" Samuel looked at Julia for permission. When she nodded, Ryker lifted him up to sit on the top rail of the fence, then handed him an apple from his pocket. "Hold your hand flat, like this," Ryker demonstrated. "That way her teeth won't accidentally nip your fingers." Samuel followed his instructions, giggling when Daisy's soft muzzle tickled his palm as she took the apple. "She likes me," he exclaimed. "Of course she does," Ryker said. "Horses can tell when someone has a good heart." Julia watched them together, a lump forming in her throat. This was what Samuel had been missing, not just a father, but a man who could show him things, teach him how to be brave and gentle at the same time. "Would you like to sit on her?" Ryker asked. Samuel's eyes grew even wider. "Can I, Mama? Please." Julia hesitated. "Is it safe?" "I'll hold him the whole time," Ryker promised. "And Daisy here, she's given rides to children half his age." "All right then," Julia agreed. Ryker opened the gate and led Daisy out. He showed Samuel how to approach the horse, speaking softly and moving slowly. Then he lifted the boy and placed him carefully on the horse's back, keeping one hand firmly on Samuel's leg and the other on Daisy's bridle. "Look, Mama, I'm riding," Samuel called, his face alight with joy. "I see, darling," Julia said, her own smile stretching wide. Ryker led Daisy in a small circle, speaking encouragingly to Samuel the whole time. After a few minutes, he lifted the boy down. "Can we do it again?" Samuel asked. "Not today, partner. Don't want to tire Daisy out. But maybe another time. Promise." Ryker glanced at Julia before answering. If your ma says it's all right, you can come back and see Daisy anytime. We'll see, Julia said, not wanting to commit. She'd already allowed more familiarity than was probably wise. After returning Daisy to her corral, Ryker invited them to share the lunch he'd packed: simple bread, cheese, and apples, eaten in the shade of a large oak tree. Samuel, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep on the blanket Ryker had spread out. Thank you for today, Julia said softly, watching her son's peaceful face. I haven't seen him this happy in a long time. He's a good boy, Ryker replied. You've done well with him. I try, but... She hesitated. It's hard sometimes, doing it alone. Ryker was quiet for a moment. My ma raised me alone too, after my pa was killed in the war. She did her best, but I know it wasn't easy for her. Julia looked at him with new understanding. Is that why you stepped in at the store? Because you understood. He nodded. No child should be made to feel less because of circumstances they can't control. He paused, then added, and no woman should be judged for carrying on after losing her husband. You seem to know a lot about it. I've seen more of the world than most folks in Copper Creek, I reckon. Seen good people struggle while those with less character prosper. He met her eyes directly. What happened at the store, it wasn't right. People here have long memories and strict ideas about propriety, Julia said. A widow with a child is always going to be the subject of talk. Unless she remarries, Ryker observed. Julia looked away. That's not so easy, Mr. Irwin. Ryker, please. Ryker. His name felt unfamiliar on her tongue. The kind of man willing to take on another man's child, well, those men are rare. Not as rare as you might think. He was watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. Mr. Ryker, she corrected herself. I appreciate your kindness to Samuel, truly, but I wouldn't want you to feel any obligation. What you did at the store was more than enough. He smiled slightly. What if it's not obligation I feel, Julia? The sound of her name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. We barely know each other. That's true, he acknowledged. But I'd like to change that if you're willing. Julia felt a flutter of panic. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to think of any man besides Jonathan. I don't know if I'm ready for friendship, Ryker said quickly. I'm offering friendship to start. For both you and Samuel. Relief mingled with a strange disappointment. Friendship I can accept. Good. He smiled, and Julia couldn't help noticing the way it transformed his face, softening the lines around his eyes. That's settled then. As the weeks passed, Ryker became a regular presence in their lives. Every Sunday after church, he would walk them to the ranch to visit Daisy. Sometimes he would appear at the mercantile near closing time, offering to escort them home. Other evenings, he would stop by their cabin with small gifts: a carved wooden horse for Samuel, fresh vegetables from the ranch garden for Julia. Each time, he was unfailingly respectful, never staying too late or presuming too much familiarity. Yet Julia found herself looking forward to his visits, planning what she would say to him, wondering what stories he might share next. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee, that he had fought briefly in the war as a very young man, and that he had spent the years since working on ranches across the West. He was 32, had never married, and could read and write better than most men she knew. Why Copper Creek? She asked one evening as they sat on her porch. Samuel was already asleep inside. Ryker considered the question. Needed a change. Heard Mason was looking for someone who could handle horses. He paused. Truth is, I've been moving around for years. Might be time to put down some roots. Here. Julia couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Copper Creek was hardly the kind of place most men chose to settle. Depends, he said. his eyes meeting hers in the fading light. Julia looked away first, her heart beating faster. They had been careful to maintain the boundaries of friendship, but sometimes like now she felt the pull of something more between them. The following Saturday, Julia was working at the Mercantile when Sheriff Parker entered. He nodded curtly to her before approaching Mr. Thornton. Though he kept his voice low, Julia could hear their conversation. "That new hand at Mason's," the sheriff was saying. "Irwin, what do you know about him?" Mr. Thornton shrugged. "Pays his bills. Seems decent enough. Been spending a lot of time with the Miller widow, from what I hear. And," Mr. Thornton's voice had an edge to it, "Mrs. Miller's a grown woman. Just wondering about his intentions is all. Got a telegram asking about a Ryker Irwin. Seems he was involved in some trouble down in Texas." Julia froze, the bolt of calico in her hands suddenly heavy. "What kind of trouble?" Mr. Thornton asked. "Man died. Bar fight, allegedly. Irwin claimed self-defense, and witnesses backed him up. No charges filed, but," the sheriff shrugged, "thought folks should know who they're dealing with." Julia's mind was spinning. Ryker had never mentioned Texas, or any trouble with the law. Was this the real reason he'd ended up in Copper Creek? Running from his past? When her shift ended, she walked home with Samuel, her thoughts in turmoil. She had just started preparing dinner when a knock came at the door. Ryker stood on her porch, his expression serious. "I need to talk to you, Julia." "Samuel," she called over her shoulder. "Go play in your room for a bit." Once Samuel was out of earshot, Julia faced Ryker. "Is it true? About Texas?" He didn't seem surprised by the question. "Sheriff Parker's been talking." "Is it true?" she repeated. Ryker sighed. "Yes. Man pulled a knife on me in a saloon. I defended myself, but he fell badly. Hit his head." His eyes held hers steadily. "I'm not proud of it, but I didn't murder him, Julia. Why didn't you tell me?" "Didn't want it to be the first thing you knew about me." He ran a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to leave that night behind." "By coming to Copper Creek? Hiding out in a town where no one knew you?" "I wasn't hiding," he said firmly. "But yes, I wanted a fresh start. Then I met you and Samuel, and—" He trailed off. "And what?" "And for the first time I thought maybe I could build something real. Something good." Julia wanted to believe him, but doubt had crept in. "I need time to think, Ryker." He nodded, his face tight with disappointment. "I understand. Just know that what I feel for you and Samuel, it's real, Julia. As real as anything I've ever felt." After he left, Julia sat alone at her kitchen table, tears streaming down her face. She had been so careful since Jonathan died, protecting herself and Samuel from further hurt. Now she had allowed Ryker into their lives, into their hearts, and she didn't know if she could trust him. Samuel emerged from his room. "Was that Ryker? Is he coming back?" Julia wiped her eyes. "I don't know, darling. But he promised to show me how to rope next time," Samuel said, his lower lip trembling. "Samuel, sometimes grown-ups have disagreements," and a frantic knocking interrupted her. Julia opened the door to find Mrs. Peterson, one of their neighbors, looking distressed. "Julia, you need to come quick. There's a fire in town, the Mercantile's burning." Julia gasped. "Mr. Thornton." "He's still inside, they think. Most of the men are at the Mason Ranch for that cattle sale. There's not enough help." Julia grabbed her shawl. "Samuel, stay with Mrs. Peterson. I need to go." "But Mama, no arguments. Please, Mrs. Peterson, watch him for me." Julia ran toward town, her heart pounding. The Mercantile was Mr. Thornton's life's work, and the man himself had been nothing but kind to her and Samuel. She had to help. As she approached the town center, she could see flames lighting up the evening sky. A crowd had gathered, passing buckets of water down a line, but the fire was already consuming the wooden structure. "Where's Mr. Thornton?" she cried, grabbing Sheriff Parker's arm. "Still inside, we think. Smoke's too thick to get in now." Just then, a figure on horseback thundered past them, heading straight for the burning building. Julia recognized Ryker's broad shoulders as he dismounted and ran toward the entrance. "Irwin, no!" the sheriff shouted. "It's too dangerous." Ryker ignored him, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth before disappearing into the smoke-filled doorway. The next few minutes were the longest of Julia's life. The crowd fell silent as they waited, the only sound the crackling of flames and the occasional crash as parts of the structure began to collapse. Finally, when Julia had almost given up hope, a figure emerged from the smoke. Ryker, with Mr. Thornton slung over his shoulder. Both men were covered in soot, coughing violently. Several men rushed forward to help lay Mr. Thornton on the ground. The old shopkeeper was conscious but barely, his breathing labored. "Someone get the doctor," Ryker shouted, his voice raw from smoke. Julia pushed through the crowd to kneel beside them. "Ryker, are you hurt?" He shook his head, still coughing. "I'm fine." He was trapped under a fallen beam. "Think his leg's broken." The town doctor arrived and began examining Mr. Thornton. Ryker stood up, swaying slightly. Julia reached out to steady him. "That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen," she said, tears in her eyes. Ryker's face was streaked with soot, but his eyes were clear as they met hers. Couldn't stand by and do nothing. In that moment, Julia knew. This was the real Ryker Irwin, not a man running from his past, but a man willing to risk his life for others. Whatever had happened in Texas, it didn't define him. "I believe you," she whispered. "About Texas. About everything." Relief washed over his face. He opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by Sheriff Parker. "That was quite a thing you did, Irwin," the sheriff said, his tone grudgingly respectful. "Reckon I misjudged you." "Wouldn't be the first time someone has," Ryker replied without rancor. "How's Thornton?" "Doc says he'll live. Smoke inhalation, broken leg, some burns. Could have been much worse if you hadn't gone in after him." Word of Ryker's heroism spread quickly through Copper Creek. By the next morning, the man who had been the subject of suspicious whispers was being hailed as a hero. Mr. Mason himself came to town to publicly thank Ryker for saving his old friend Thornton, and announced that he was promoting Ryker to ranch foreman. 2 days later, with Mr. Thornton recovering at the doctor's house, Ryker came to Julia's cabin. His hands, she noticed, were still red and blistered from the fire. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "Life's too short for waiting. What happened at the mercantile, it made that clear." "What are you saying, Ryker?" He took her hands gently in his. "I'm saying I love you, Julia Miller. You and Samuel both. I know it hasn't been long, and I know you might not be ready, but I want to build a life with you." Julia's heart felt too big for her chest. "Ryker, You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need. I just wanted you to know where I stand." "I don't need time," Julia said, surprising herself with her certainty. "When I thought I might lose you in that fire, I knew then what I'd been afraid to admit." "And what's that?" he asked, hope lighting his eyes. "That I love you too." Ryker's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. He pulled her close, and when their lips met, Julia felt something long dormant within her spring back to life. "Mama!" Samuel's voice came from behind them. They broke apart to find him standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Ryker knelt down to the boy's level. "Samuel, I have something important to ask you. I love your mama, and I want to marry her. But you're the man of this family, so I need your permission first." Samuel looked solemnly between them. "If you marry Mama, Will you be my pa? If you'll have me, Ryker said, his voice thick with emotion. I'd be honored to be your pa. Samuel considered this for a moment, then nodded decisively. Thomas Whitaker said I'd never have a pa, but he was wrong. He sure was, Ryker agreed, opening his arms. Samuel rushed into them, and Ryker pulled Julia into the embrace as well. As his strong arms encircled them both, Julia remembered that day in the mercantile when he had first protected them. No more, he had said then, promising to shield them from cruelty. No more, she whispered now, but with a different meaning. No more loneliness, no more fear, no more feeling incomplete. They were married in the rebuilt mercantile 3 months later, with Mr. Thornton giving the bride away and Samuel proudly serving as best man. Mrs. Whitaker and her son were conspicuously absent, but most of the town turned out to celebrate the union. With his promotion, Ryker was able to build them a small house on Mason land, where Samuel had room to run and play with the gentle horses his new father taught him to ride. Julia found work she enjoyed, helping Mrs. Mason with the household accounts and correspondence. A year after the wedding, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, a name that seemed to capture everything they had found in each other. As Julia watched Ryker teach Samuel to cradle his baby sister, her heart overflowed with gratitude for the man who had put his arm around them that day and changed their lives forever. In the years that followed, whenever a new widow or fatherless child arrived in Copper Creek, it was the Irwin family who welcomed them first, creating a circle of protection that expanded to include anyone who needed it. And if anyone dared suggest that Samuel wasn't Ryker's real son, they needed only to see the two of them together, heads bent over a project, matching smiles on their faces, to know that some bonds run deeper than blood. Love, Julia had learned, could build a family as solid and true as any ever created. And sometimes it took just one person brave enough to step forward and say no more to change the course of many lives.